Today's video is a request by Commander Captain's Quarters. If you have a video request, then you can join at the Commander tier. Or if you'd be interested in supporting the channel further, I have launched a new tier called Navarch. Those who join at this tier will become immortalized as original characters in my content. So consider joining, it really helps the channel. Thank you very much. So Captain's Quarters requested for me to look at one specific ship. We've talked a lot about the astropolitics or geopolitics of Star Trek and how it corresponds to real life nations. So perhaps the Romulans are the American imperialists, or the Klingons are the Russians, but one thing is certain: the Tholians are Swiss. And today we're going to be looking at the definitive, the only canon and the most definitive Tholian ship, the Tholian web spinner. The Tholians are perhaps one of the most unique races in terms of concept. They're very strange and interesting. I wish we got more of them, especially in New Trek, because I think modern effects could really do them justice. And the ship equally is just as unique as they are. In fact, I think it's wrong to think of the Tholian web spinner as a ship, so much as it is a very large EVA suit. It's an extension of the pilot's body into the vacuum of space. So in terms of behind the scenes, obviously we're going way back to original series era. It was a Matt Jeffries design, and obviously was designed on the cheap. It was two wood blocks two wooden models with some reflective paneling on the back. Interestingly enough, actually, apparently the web spinning shot, that little shot of them starting to spin the web together, apparently that won a VFX prize. Now, it doesn't look particularly remarkable to us today, but bearing in mind this is, 1965 when the Tholian web comes out? That's a very impressive effects shot for that period. So, that's a very interesting accolade for the Tholian web spinner to have. There was then a new model, a 3D model, CG model, in the remaster of the episode. And then, of course, there was an Enterprise model by John Eaves, which is slightly different in coloration, but is really just a more textured and detailed, slightly sleeker version of the same ship. Interestingly, it was apparently the only design by John Eaves where he took it to the producers and they just approved it as is, which is quite interesting. I mean, I guess it's a Tholian ship, and as long as you're keeping to that shape, there's not many places to go wrong. So that's interesting. There is some scale uncertainty with that model, because the Tholian ship is generally held to be about 15 meters long, but there are some shots of it in Enterprise where it looks a little bit bigger, or sometimes a lot bigger, which is just interesting. But because it's so, I suppose you've got to show it in the shot, but show it to be a reasonable size. But that's just really the behind-the-scenes history, so we'll get into the in-universe. We know that there were Tholian web spinners in the 22nd and 23rd century. I'd be shocked if there weren't also Tholian web spinners in the 21st and 24th century. I don't see the Tholians dropping this design, and this design is really emblematic of the Tholian assembly. It is everything that they stand for, and really encompasses all their kind of astropolitical objectives in one design. And it is basically built for the same purpose today as it was 100 years ago: spinning webs. And this is part of course, Tholian Doctrine, a doctrine which is very defensive and which this ship fully encompasses. It's very reflective of the Tholian, physiology, in that it's a web spinning, so obviously it imitates a behavior that they have. But also that it is very individualized. It's a one-man ship, so there's a lot of emphasis on the individual in some respects, but that individual is to work as part of a larger whole, generally, for the spinning of webs. And it is very defensive. You can't really go on the attack effectively with Tholian web spinners. You could try. You're not going to go anywhere. But that being said, if you try attacking the Tholians, you're not going to get very far, because you're going to be confronted by web spinners and they're going to, spin a web. In that respect, it's just completely encapsulates the Tholian approach and the Tholian psychology. Its power is multiplied by numbers. So because of that, it can only really be brought to bear defensively when you can bring large numbers together. That is really where its strength is at. It's also, I'm just thinking of a comparison, I think comparatively, because it's built towards such a singular purpose on achieving one specific thing, and it does that, and all of its function channels towards that. And that actually is very reminiscent of the Swedish S-Tank, or Stridswagen, I think it's called that. Correct me if I'm wrong if you're Swedish. But the S-Tank, which is basically a modern tank destroyer, but, you know, with the modern age. So, essentially, it's a gun placed in a tank. The gun itself has no traverse. It traverses via the tracks, so the tracks can be turned very minutely so that it can be properly adjusted onto a target. And the gun has no elevation mechanism either. It is instead elevated and depressed by means of the hydraulic suspension. And by adjusting that, you elevate and depress the gun. I believe it's a 2-man vehicle, maybe 3-man? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's a 2-man vehicle. Paring it down to the most basic elements that are necessary for its job. Now, as an offensive weapon, it would be awful. For going out and finding targets and destroying them on the move, it would be awful. But that is not what the S-Tank was built for. The S-Tank is built purely and specifically as a defensive weapon for hiding in the bushes, hiding in the trees, and taking out Soviet armor. That was what it was built for. And you can see the focus, the laser focus on that design, because it is essentially focused on that role and that role alone. And that makes it very unique. And I would say makes it a very good equivalent for the Tholian web spinner. I think the two are very, very much alike. Laser focused on achieving a very specific objective. In terms of its capability, as I say, it's a one-man crew. Now this enables you to maximize manpower, because you free up, or Tholian power, because Tholians are neither male nor female. Free up Tholian power in order to more widely spread your numbers and your defensive net, because as I say before, the more web spinners you have, the more powerful each one is. That's where it really comes in. So that is why, particularly with a vessel like this, you want to maximize the availability of personnel. It does look like it has warp drive, and actually, from looking at the configuration, it looks like a tri-nacelle design. Now, normally a tri-nacelle, particularly when the nacelles are put far out from the ship's center of mass, normally that means that the warp field is unstable, and that provides you greater warp field maneuverability. But because of how close in the nacelles are, I would actually speculate that it's actually more akin to a annular warp drive, in that it's designed to just shoot the web spinner, spin the web spinner like a bullet, spin it through warp speed on a straight course, on a straight line interception course, which if it's a purely defensive vessel, that's perfectly acceptable, and it's basically just going to be making interception and shuttle runs between probably a home base or a carrier or a station and whatever it needs to be intercepting. That's all it's going to do. So again, laser focused, and by having that tri-nacelle design, they increase the power of that warp field. Combined with the rotation, you get the effect of an annular warp field, which enables much greater speeds, but you can't turn. But it's fine, because you know where you're going. Now, in terms of what it does when it encounters the target, obviously, strong language is a great start. Rude gestures can also be helpful, but more often than not, if someone's violating your space, you might have to use weapons. Now, in and of itself, the Tholian web spinner is pretty unremarkable. It's got basic particle cannons, some shields, and tractor beams. Nothing really there, really. I mean, that's pretty pathetic, although it's worth taking into account for a 15-meter vessel, and that's reasonably well furnished. It's enough to get by. But That's not its primary weapon. In fact, the Tholian web spinner doesn't carry its primary weapon. The Tholian web spinner is a component in a larger primary weapon, and of course, that is the Tholian web, the iconic Tholian web. That is the primary weapon, which all the Tholian ships, all the web spinners, are a part of. They don't carry the weapon, they are components in the weapon. And like I say, that puts great emphasis in sort of the hive mind and cooperation. This is very fitting in some respect. So you have two modes of operation for the web spinner that we observe, and it's worth taking into account the different contexts. So we see in the mirror darkly, we see them use the web spinner at short range, relatively short range, with multiple ships, more than two, and they can instantly generate a web. Now, you'll be wondering why they didn't then do this in the episode Tholian Web. My speculation is that this is tied to range. At close range, Tholian ships can immediately initiate a web and form it pretty much instantaneously, provided they have enough ships to connect the various beams together. They can form a web very quickly. That being said, in order to do that, you have to be pretty close to your target, and that means that the target might be taking exception to having a web made around it, so it only works if the ship is unable to fire, like in the Mirror Darkly, where Enterprise is cloaked, or supposedly can't fire. I'm not getting into that controversy. It shouldn't have been able to fire. We also see an interesting effect, and that is that the Tholian web, when the Enterprise does fire, it redirects the weapons fire back to inside of the field, and it seems to do damage to the Enterprise by them trying to shoot out of it. Now, also, once that web is completed, it no longer needs the ships to be feeding it any power. Once the web is fully formed and its energy matrix is stabilized, it appears to maintain itself perfectly fine, and we can assume the same of the larger web, and this is where Tholian webs can get really crazy. So in the Tholian web, only two Tholian ships face the Enterprise, and they start drawing a web together, but they seem to be doing it at very long range, presumably to stay out of Enterprise's weapon range, but that means that they can't, A, there's only two of them, and B, they can't instantaneously initiate the web. They have to spin the web manually, as it were. But when that web forms, they will no longer have to put any energy into it. That web is permanent, at least until they choose to deactivate it. That's a very, very powerful thing. Think about this. The Tholians see you coming. Rather than wait for you to get there, they can immediately form up a web in your path, a giant web in space, and they just leave it there. That's what the Tholian web can do. It's a very, very useful tool, not just for catching ships, but also for just controlling their movement and blocking them off against a very defensive weapon. That is, unless you're caught in the Tholian web. Now, it can do one of two things. If you're caught in a Tholian web, which I don't advise, it can either be static and just stay there, and, they can have words with you or whatever, or they can shrink the web and slice your ship apart with the various energy strings, or they can just fire weapons into it as well. So in terms of as a means of protecting one's territory, dissuading intruders and catching intruders, and bringing them around to perhaps a more reasonable state of mind, the Tholian web is an excellent defensive weapon. Now, going on the attack with it is a whole nother matter, because your enemy is likely not waiting for you to arrive and start making a web around them. But in terms of a defensive weapon for defending Tholian territory, the Tholian web spinner is excellent, and that is really the key thing. The web spinner is part of this defensive weapon. It is part of a larger weapon system, and that really makes the Tholian web spinner completely unique in its design philosophy. There's no other ship quite like it. Even other Tholian ships are often a little bit more conventional in many respects. But the Tholian web spinner just encapsulates, in a small little 15-meter long starship, perfectly encapsulates Tholian philosophy. It really does. And, looking at it, it's worked for over 300 years. I really doubt the Tholian web spinner is going anywhere. So, next time you're in Tholian space, make sure you've got all your permits, or you might get caught up. See you all next time.